Hello, everyone. It's Aunt Nikki of Your Story Hour. How are you guys doing today? Are you looking forward to chapter 26 of Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, and Still Mo by Sam Campbell? I know I am. It's called Lieutenant in a Kimono. The old oak tree in whose branches Eeny had once lived had never looked on a lovelier campfire evening. A robin perched in its crest and in song foretold the close of day. The sturdy oak had stretched far its strong arms and ruffled up its leafy locks in the last breeze of twilight. It had seen the evening star sparkling in the afterglow and watched weary wavelets come to rest. A quiet cool that was close to frost settled in an invisible blanket over the northland and put all pestersome mosquitoes to sleep. Then out of dark distance came the call of bullfrogs, the voices of the night heron, and the great barred owl. The old oak had witnessed many such campfire parties. Through the years it had looked with leafy dignity on our fire-lighting circles, echoed our laughter and our songs, and added silent counsel to our serious moments. Now again it had seen us gather with armloads of wood and baskets of food. It had seen friends come across the water by boat and canoe, heard our greetings warm with friendship, and seen us kneel to light the fire. It was a momentous and distinctive evening, even though it was not meant to be. Really, it was supposed to be exactly like all the other campfire evenings before it, and like those to come. Duke wanted it that way. How would he like to spend his last evening at the sanctuary? Why, just like the others. Certainly not as though it were his last. His day should be devoted to wandering in the forest looking for adventure, his evening to a campfire gathering at the foot of the old oak, like those so often held there before. He wanted North Woods companions here, and music, and happiness, and food of the kind that fit such occasions best. So it was that friends came to spend this campfire evening with our soldier, not the last, just the latest one, we all agreed. And in spite of wartime difficulties, we had found steaks to broil, thick, tender, and juicy. Each friend who came had brought some miracle in a covered dish: salad, homemade rolls, potatoes done in secret and luscious ways, tasty puddings, delicious pies. While hours sped by, the old oak tree watched those happy goings-on, and in sylvan way smiled down on us and entered into the fun. Possibly it saw some of the uninvited guests who crashed the party gate, but it gave us no warning. Up from the water's edge towards the firelight crept an awkward little figure, wet from a swim from the mainland. It moved through the ferns and low balsam boughs until it appeared unnoticed on the campfire circle. Then, with a little low grunt, it turned to the darkness again, worked silently past the foot of the oak, around to where someone had placed a valued plate of food for a moment on a camp chair. Here the little visitor rose on its hind legs and sniffed at the tempting dinner. Parts of it were to his liking and parts not. So, with a heavily clawed foot, he reached for his chosen bits and promptly pulled the whole plate of food off the chair and upside down on the ground. Then came the discovery, mixed with dismay, that Salt, the old turpent porcupine, had come to our gathering. All were on their feet at once, not only to greet our old pet, but to put plates, cups, dishes, skillets, wraps, and everything else that a porcupine could chew on or tip over, far from his possible reach. Salt sat up, sniffed at the many hands that were reaching for him in greeting, listened to the silly things that were said, and then began feasting on the dinner which was served him on the ground. The old oak tree said nothing of the numerous figures that later came from the water and circled us unnoticed while we drowned their soft footfalls with our singing. They too were dripping wet from their swim. They must have looked like little furry ghosts, moving with such ease and purpose through the darkness, and gathering like a clan at the back door of the cabin. They found food to their liking. and it was from a spat over who had the most of it that we learned of their presence. Giny took a flashlight and went to investigate. A moment later she called for Duke to come greet the guests. There were 2 old raccoons, Rack and Roon, who had so often come to our feeding station. But this time, as if out of tribute to our soldier, they had brought along their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. There were a dozen or more coons, tumbling over one another, running under the house and out again, darting through the darkness and filling the island with life. There's a picture of them. I had been watching Duke much throughout the day and evening. In spite of the fact that he wanted this day to be like every other day, it was apparent that he could not disregard facts. This was his last full day at the sanctuary. He had kept very busy during the daytime, but the events woven into the hours had farewells written in them. I had seen him land at the point where Eeny had been located and spent some time there. Then his canoe was on the beach near Moe's Newfoundland, and later at the shore of the country of Meeny and Miney. At the island he spent much time with Stilmo, the chipmunks, and Bluey, taking each creature through its stunts as if trying to fasten all this firmly in his memory. At the campfire, Duke had entered everything with enthusiasm. He drank in the soft beauty of night, sang and joked with our friends. But as the evening wore on, I noticed that he became more and more quiet. He was apart from the group and sat near the limit of firelight, looking in silence at the star-filled skies. For a long time he stayed there, obviously in deep thought. When presently he returned to the circle, his mood had sobered, and there was a faraway look in his eyes that had distressed us before. His lips were drawn tight over his teeth, and he seemed not to hear the comments and jibes that several friends hurled at him. Making his way over to the old oak, he leaned his back against it, folded his arms, and with preoccupied expression stared into the fire. For a few moments he seemed to have forgotten where he was and that we were present. Suddenly awakened from this, he realized he'd been acting strangely, and he made an effort to rise out of the mood. "How about some more music?" he asked, and there was more music. He joined in the songs with forced cheerfulness, but I could see that our captain had not been healed of the hidden scar of war. There was a thinly covered heaviness in our entire group thereafter, which led to an early breakup of the campfire party. Good nights and good lucks were said as the guests took their leave. They sang a little as they went out into the night in their several boats and canoes. The fire had been built up to light their way and for the lovely scene they might look back on. Giny, Duke, and I stood looking into the quiet night, listening to the last faint sounds of our departing friends. Salt had rearrested himself from somewhere in the dark depths of the island and moved slowly up to our feet. However, he did not give his usual little grunt of greeting. We could hear the rustle of his quills as he walked awkwardly along, but he did not use his voice. Then we realized that nature had gone into one of her rare moods of absolute quiet. We spoke of silence and solitude in relation to the natural world, and yet sound is generally present. It is simply sound that is not irritating, and we call it silence. But occasionally nature does away with all that is audible. She stills the voices of her children with a kind of charm that she alone knows. Then in her secret chambers there is not only silence and solitude, there is a miraculous quiet that carries with it a deep rest. What command is given to bring this profound hush is a secret of the ages. We only know that it happens. Such occasions are rare in our experience, so rare that we speak of them with reverence and awe, and when we stand as witness of this miracle in quiet, we find we too are led by something within us to hold our voices and avoid even the slightest sound. So the 4 of us, Salt included, stood on the shore of our island and marveled at the heavenly silence in the ebony mansions of this Northwood night. At first, far out on the water, faint in starlight, we could see the departing boats looking like floating shadows. But one at a time they disappeared around the point, and if the massive shades of the distant wooden shores had absorbed them. One canoe trailed the other slightly. Though it was nearly half a mile away, we could hear distinctly the drip of water from its paddles. Then it too vanished into the hush and mystery which ruled the wilderness. Now not a voice was raised to break the spell, not one. It might be expected that one bullfrog might violate the decree of nature, perhaps one raccoon might emit a single trill, one coyote might try his lungs to hear his own echo, or one nighthawk give his rasping call. But Giny, Duke, Salt, and I could not find even a whisper of a sound in the infinite stillness about us. Not even the whir of a wing, the rustle of a leaf, the breaking of a wavelet on the shore dared break the dictum which governed this heavenly moment. The children of nature were listening with all their being, listening, perchance, to a soft but omnipresent voice which spoke within them, telling the thing of divine. For one could not look on this marvelous moment without feeling that God was moving on the face of the waters to bring about a Christ-like calm, that all created things knelt in silent prayer before Him. We human beings seem unable to remain at high altitudes long. For a few minutes we stood there fully attuned, but then the rather noisy call of things to be done was heard. Giny went to the cabin to begin straightening up the wholly happy disorder which follows a campfire dinner. Duke, Salt, and I remained behind to straighten up the campgrounds and finally to put out the fire. Salt was his usual helpful self, getting right in my way whether I turned. Presently my attention was drawn to Duke, who was half kneeling beside the fire, looking vacantly at the glowing coals. His appearance startled me. The expression on his face was so foreign to it that I had not known for sure it was him. I could easily believe a stranger had just arrived. He looked years older. His lips were tightly drawn, his brow wrinkled, and he drew his hand slowly across his forehead, as if something there pained him severely. I went to him and put my arm across his broad shoulders. He seemed not to notice me. "Duke, old boy," I said, "you haven't left it all in the forest, have you? Something still gets you." The soldier nodded his head. "But sometimes we get rid of things by talking," I persisted. "Don't you want to bring it out and just put it in words and see if we can't whip it that way?" He nodded again and yet said nothing, apparently not knowing just where to begin. "Let me see if I am right, Duke," I continued. "Is it that you dread going back so terribly?" He looked at me in an intense seriousness, in words uttered slowly and in low voice to emphasize his point. He said, "I dread it so much. I wonder if I have turned yellow." And he shook his head a little when he said the last word, as if to give physical pain. "Duke, don't talk like that," I exclaimed. "You know that isn't true. You know you will face whatever is before you and do whatever duty demands. You know that, don't you?" Duke thought for a moment. "Yes, I suppose I will. But why should I dread it so? Others go back into it, and while no one likes it, they don't feel the way I do. And it doesn't seem to be the fighting I think of. It is—" He quieted for a moment. "Just what is it, Duke?" I asked, trying not to make the sympathy I felt too obvious. "Come on, let's name it, and we'll know what to fight." Duke was thinking hard. "I have tried to do that. It seems to be something I can't get a hold of. It feels as if I were going into something vast and entirely empty. It isn't what is there that I fear. It is what isn't there. Just a great dark night with nothing in it. Sounds silly, but that is the picture that haunts me. I can't get rid of it." Duke had risen and stood rubbing one closed fist against the palm of his other hand. The fire was losing itself in ashes, and far and wide the forest's mood of silence still prevailed. Then came the faint sound made by dripping paddles. We looked out into the night, and when the firelight had left our eyes, we saw the last canoe was returning to us. "There is some mail for you," called one from the canoe. "Had it in my pocket and forgot to give it to you. I'm glad we did, because it gave us an excuse for more canoeing." Greetings flew back and forth, and we made friendly but somewhat uncomplimentary remarks about their forgetfulness and comments on the previous silence of the night. Duke and I met them at the water's edge, where they presented us with letters, several for our captain. He went to read them by the firelight. Our friends in the canoes started away again to enjoy more of the still night, they said, but they had very little opportunity. Suddenly the mood of nature was abruptly changed. There was sound in the air, lots of it, and it went bouncing around the shores in echoes that grew louder and louder. In some past I have had a horror of anything breaking up the quiet of nature. Giny and I even avoid a whisper, but the sharp, startling, persistent sound that came to me what then was the most beautiful music I have ever heard, I believe. I can't describe it. Maybe if you could get a dozen kingfishers, 3 or 4 wild geese, a turkey gobbler, and some red squirrels to indulge their wildest chatter all at once, it might be something like it. I don't know. But I repeat, I have never heard anything more welcome or truly beautiful. I fairly ran towards the campfire. There was Duke, all entangled in an old-time cackle spasm. His arms were wrapped around his midsection as he bent over in near hysterics, and he gave out those peals of laughter that seemed to start at his feet and go all the way up to the top of his head. Involuntarily I let out the war-whoop that I had reserved for occasions of great joy. It bounced around the shores too, and silence was even less than a memory. But if nature didn't like it, it was just too bad. To hear Duke break loose was the answer to my deepest prayer. There were calls from the departing canoeists asking what was going on and if we needed help. I assured them everything was under control. Somewhat. But Duke had got hold of himself enough to make explanations, and they were certainly in order. Giny had come from the cabin, and we stood together laughing at him and waiting to know what was up. "Listen to this! Listen to this!" cried Duke, so excited each word stepped on the heels of the other one before it. He was holding a letter in his hand and trying to see it clearly in spite of low firelight and tears in his eyes. Then, in sentences that were often broken by outbursts of laughter, he revealed to us a story akin to many in the world. It was a letter from an army pal. The boy had been presumably lost on the raid in which Duke was hurt. He was missing for a time and then showed up again. In meantimes, he had been cared for by native guerrillas. "But listen to this!" Duke fairly shouted. We were listening all over. "He saw the loot! Lieutenant Stillmo! He saw him!" Duke was shaking with excitement, and we were too. This loot wasn't hurt a bit except in his feelings. He's still back in the island somewhere with the guerrillas, and what do you think? Here Duke lost himself in another outburst of laughter. It was just like old times. He pounded his chest and stomped his feet. We waited rather impatiently for him to get ready to tell us more. "The loot was dressed in a kimono!" It was all Duke could do to get the last word out. His voice broke into a series of hee-haws. Then he began dressing up his story. The loot had his clothes destroyed during the action. The only thing the guerrillas had that would fit him was that dress. Duke could hardly stand it. Why, the loot's neck was that big. He measured off the size of a stovepipe. Stillmo's arms were as big as hams, he said, and his muscles looked like a boa that had swallowed a pig. Think of all that in a kimono! And Duke was lost in another spasm. "It couldn't have been a kimono," laughed Duke. "It must have been a tent." With many calls of "hoo-hoo!" he demonstrated with a saucy strut how the lute would parade about, how he would do a hula dance, powder his nose, and pluck his eyebrows. "And he's so taut you couldn't drive a nail in him," our soldier raved on. "I might have known a little dynamite couldn't dent his carcass. The rascal!" The leaves of the ancient oak rustled a little in newly born forest breeze. The campfire perished in a cloud of steam as a pail of water extinguished its last embers. Nature had withdrawn its decree of silence, and little voices spoke in the forest depth. An osprey was crying somewhere in the distance, and the old owl called as if he was talking in a rain barrel. Salt dipped into the water and swam away on some secret mission. The last of the raccoons had left. Duke sang a little song as he went to bed. His letter had been read to ribbons. Late into the night, we heard him giving little phrases of laughter as he recalled again the story it had brought. But we knew this was not just amusement. There was really nothing so funny about Lieutenant Stillmose dressed in a kimono. Duke was just supremely happy. That was all. Thanks for joining us today. 2 more chapters and we're done with the book. Good thing it's recorded because you can listen anytime you want. See you guys later.